Hey, hello everyone. Welcome back to another live stream. And yes, I've got coffee again, and let's hope that this time I do not wear said coffee. So I hope you're all well. Happy Friday, last day of semester, right? Today's live stream, I suppose, is well timed. The end of semester. It's a good time to answer any questions that you may have about the exam. So if you have any questions about the exam, please feel free to start firing them through on the discussion thread here in the chat room. So let's have a look on the discussion board and see what people have put there. Nothing there quite yet about the exam, but there was somewhere else on this discussion board, wasn't there? Let's have a little look. There's an exam question. Oh, there's a good one. Okay, so here is a good question from Claudia. And the question is, will there be anything about SPSS on the exam? Yes, there will be. There will be things about SPSS on the exam. There will be things that you have seen in SPSS that I will be asking you about on the exam. And you know what? I'm going to look at the exam right now on my computer so that I can get a feeling for exactly what it is I'm talking about here, because I've got a memory like a sieve. But yes, there will be things that you'll need to remember from your work with research methods in the tutorials. In fact, why don't we talk about research methods, seeing it's my section of one of my sections of the subject. Yes, the tutorials are examinable. They have got examinable content for research methods. Particularly the critical thinking tutorial is one that you want to pay attention to. So there was a lot of examinable content delivered in that tutorial or practical class. This is the one where you learned about reasoning and argument formation and thinking critically about psychological research. You learned about things like deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, and you learned about how the premises relate to the conclusions in each one of those types of arguments. A deductive argument, of course, is where you've got sort of broad premises supporting a very specific conclusion, a broad start and a narrow finish, but a finish that's absolute. Of course, you might recall that deductive arguments are arguments where the premises provide absolute for support for the conclusion. If the premises are the case, the conclusion must follow. That would be a valid deductive argument. And with inductive arguments, we're using specific premises as the basis for a more broad conclusion. So it's more of an opening out type of argument. We're based on specific observations. We're making a broader inference. And in that type of argument, you might also recall that we're not talking about absolute support. We're talking about degrees of strength of argument here with inductive argument. We might say we've got a weak or a strong argument based on how well the premises support the conclusion that's provided. So I'm harping on about that, aren't I? Which probably tells you there's going to be a couple of exam questions coming from that tutorial. There will also be Module 11 made available today, which is just summarizing what was in that tutorial, really. So if you go by the tutorial slides, you will be fine for the exam, or if you go by Module 11 that's uploaded later today, you will also be fine for that particular part of that critical thinking part of the exam. So just so long as you know that critical thinking, involves, I suppose, active consumption of claims and conclusions that we're presented with in everyday life, but certainly also in psychological literature, and that when you hear a claim, you think about things like what's the evidence for that claim, and what's the quality of the evidence. And then, of course, because you now know so much about research methodology, you can also go and ask about consider the quality of the research methods and whether the research design, for example, was appropriate for the type of claim that was made. So, for example, we talked earlier in the research methods course about inferring causation. And you'd know that if somebody was making a causal claim about data based on, say, a correlational design, then that's a problem, isn't it? And you would treat that conclusion or claim that was made with probably some contempt and question it, and rightfully so. Here come some questions. Thanks, folks. Will the practical questions for the research methods part be released later? Do you mean questions that you answered in class from an activity sheet or something like that? That should already be up on the LMS. So anyway, just again to wind up, if you want a refresher on inductive and deductive reasoning and argument formation, keep an eye out on the LMS later today, and that module will appear. And again, it's just rehashing what was done in the critical thinking practical class. So while we talk about research methods, specifically, the things that are going to be examinable for research methods are the practical classes and modules, except for number 7. So that answers your question there, Sammy. So module 7, you don't need to worry about that because it's going to make an appearance next week along with module 12, but they're just for your interest. They're not examinable. So it's modules 1 through 6, and then 8 through 11. They're the things that will be examinable for research methods. And again, module 11 is the same as the critical thinking practical class that you've already done, essentially. Yeah, so that's a really good question. Philippa, thanks for that. So Philip is asking here if there's going to be actually, can you guys see each other's comments out there? Can you let me know if you can see the questions that are being asked? That'd be really helpful. I don't know if I'm supposed to approve them or not. Oh, you can. Good. Okay. So thank you. Whoa, excellent. Oh, yay. Look at all those people out there. Okay, yes, you should know how to read SPSS output. You should know how to read a frequency table. You want to know how to read a graphical interpretation of data. I talked about a couple of those this semester, didn't I? I talked about histograms and I talked about box plots. Those things would be really good to know. And remember oh gosh, I can't even remember what module it would be. But I talked about distributions of data. This is before we even started talking about central tendency and variability. I talked about distributions of data, how we form a frequency distribution and how that can be represented graphically. We talked about things like skew. All of those sorts of things would be very useful to know about for the exam. The research methods program has been completely refreshed, reimagined this year, as you know, and it should be really quite obvious, I think, in each module what the important things are going to be about. And each practical class will sort of confirm what the important things were. And it's the important things, really, that I'm going to be asking about. There's going to be, of course, 30 questions on the exam coming from the research methods component of the subject. And you can think about those questions being largely equally spread over the modules and the practical classes that you have completed. I'm just pulling up the exam right now. And you can rest assured that there will be no surprises. There will be no surprises at all on the research methods component of the exam, or the exam more broadly, certainly also my learning section of the exam. No surprises there. Again, I told you that I'd be asking you about the really important things, not just some insignificant random date or something like that you might need to remember that I murmured at some point in the lecture. I've only got around 3 questions to ask from each lecture. So certainly I'll be asking about important things that I want to make sure you've learned about. Will there be SPSS screenshots for you to fill in or to tick stuff? That's a really good question, Andy. The Mind, Brain and Behavior 1 exam is multiple choice. So you will receive a question book that has got the questions from the exam. So the 120 questions that are there will be in a book, and then you'll also receive an answer sheet. And the answer sheet is basically rows of circles that correspond to options A, B, C, and D, and you will need to color in for each question the corresponding answer, color in the circle that corresponds to one of the options, the multiple choice options that we have given you. So as a result, there's no ability to do any sort of, completing a diagram from SPSS or anything like that. It will be interpretation. So I will certainly provide you with something that's come from SPSS, and there's not too much of this at all, but there certainly is something that's come from SPSS, and you will need to interpret that. There's quite a few different types of questions, I suppose, in the research methods component of the exam. There's questions that are asking about definitions and just tapping fundamental knowledge. And then there's questions that are asking you to apply that fundamental knowledge to a problem. And I suppose there's a variety of difficulty levels then in the questions. And that's very much the way in which I would structure other areas of the exam, and your other lecturers, Jason and Simon and Meredith, have also structured their sections of the exam. Let's let's have a look here. So I'm just scrolling back up. And if you want to go back over the inductive and deductive reasoning bit, that video will be out later. But when this is finished, you can always go back and watch this live stream again. Roediger and McDermott paper. Yeah, I'd be learning about that. I reckon that was a pretty important part of the program, wasn't it? This idea of first false memories for words presented in lists. I would definitely be learning about that. That spanned more than one practical class. And I'm sure that Meredith also mentioned it to some point in a lecture. So, the practical classes, certainly for research methods, are definitely examinable. More broadly, I would be thinking of them as containing content that you should be familiar with. In that most, if not all, of the content that's been presented in practical classes has also been talked about in the lecture. So, we had an entire practical class almost on receptive fields, right, for Simon's component of the course, didn't we? So one would imagine if Simon's lectured about it and there's been an entire practical class about it, there's probably going to be an exam question about it. And of course, Simon has actually given you his exam questions, hasn't he? He just hasn't given you the answers. So with that in mind, I suppose you could think logically and think, gosh, if there was so much time devoted to this particular topic, and is there a question on this that Simon has given us? Maybe that might be on the exam. That might be a way to do it. And again, it's going to feel overwhelming because you've just been bombarded with so much content this semester. I completely understand that. The way to go about, I would recommend the way to go about studying for this exam is to remember that each lecturer has 30 questions to ask, roughly. So Jason's got 30, Simon's got 30, I've got 30 for research methods, and then Meredith and I have split the end with 10 from me for learning and 20 from her for language and memory and cognition. So that means that we've only got about 3 questions to ask from each lecture, roughly, and we will, for the most part, focus on the main points. Again, there's going to be variability in the types of questions. Some will merely be definition, some will require some more critical thought and application of knowledge to problems. You will have plenty of time to do this, by the way. You have got 3 hours in which to do a 2-hour exam. So, you've got tons of time. When I say it's a 2-hour exam, the normal amount of time that we would set for a 120 choice, 120 question multiple exam is 2 hours. But we're giving you 3 hours because it's first year. It might be your first time experiencing an exam. I understand that so many students are sitting the exam in English, and English may not be your first language. And so there's certainly all of that difficulty that comes with trying to sit an exam in a second language. And gosh, I just take my hat off to you if you are doing that and you are sitting the exam in a second language. I think when I was in Italy just recently, the extent of my Italian went to ordering an Aperol Spritz. Yeah, so well done if you are sitting the exam and English is not your first language. And on that topic, if you do sit the exam and English is not your first language, you can take a bilingual dictionary. I've already approved bilingual dictionaries for the whole exam, so you don't need to get a permission form to take one in advance. Like used to be the case, you can just turn up with your bilingual bilingual dictionary to help you with the exam. So there is going to be 3 hours to do the exam and 15 minutes reading time at the start. And during that reading time, you won't actually be able to complete anything on the exam. You'll just be able to read through the exam and get a feel for the exam. To tell you the truth, when I used to do exams, that 15 minutes I spent when I'd go through the exam, I pretty much had the exam done in my head by the time I was ready to write, and that 15 minutes was up. And I think you might find that you have most of the answers in your head by the time you've read through the exam. If you finish the exam early, are you allowed to leave early? Yes, you can, but there are certain restrictions about how early or late into the exam you can do this. So if it's too close to the end, they might not let you leave. But when you get to the exam, and I will be there at the exam with you, I will be there for question time for the start of the exam, and you'll hear an announcement that will you'll hear an announcement that will tell you the details of all of the conditions, when you can leave, when you can't, and so forth. Thanks for your question, Florence. You are correct. Yes, the exam is presented in that order. So there's 30 questions from neuroscience, then 30 from sensation and perception, 10 from me for learning, 20 from Meredith for language and cognition, and lastly, 30 from me for research methods. So that's Snow, Mr. Snow, we will call you. Thank you, Mr. Snow. Yes, good job for pitching in there. Will you be able to watch this later? Yes, you will be able to watch this later. Oh yes, Philippa, that's right. Yeah, you can't just walk in and begin reading time. There is a set reading time that will start. So once everybody is seated, and well, not necessarily once everyone is seated, but everyone is typically seated. Some people will be running late, and just know that they're not going to hold up the exam or reading time if you're running late. Make sure that my advice is to give yourself plenty of time. So this is Melbourne, right? And we've all been on public transport in Melbourne, and we all know that it is subject to failure at a moment's notice. So my advice to you, to avoid stress on the day, is to leave a little bit earlier than you might otherwise, to make sure that you're there on time. And, you know, if you want to grab a coffee, you can get a coffee over at the museum, which is just next door to the big building. Where are we here? And, you know, just give yourself time to get there, not turn up late, be able to go in and get comfortable and be settled and not be stressed out. So for those of you who are sitting the main exam, I'll be there with you. And for those who have alternative exam arrangements that will be sitting the exam in other places, Simon will be coming to visit you at the start of the exam. Okay, so will the questions, particularly be word-based, not labeling diagrams? Yeah, they're all pretty, well, good. That's a very good question, Mr. Snow. Yes, pretty much word-based throughout. There will be some diagrams to look at. in places, particularly in the research methods section. But yeah, they're generally word-based questions. But, particularly with behavioral neuroscience, I suppose, and when you're thinking about neuroanatomy, it can be really useful to learn from diagrams as you go and from pictures so that you can get a picture of where your temporal lobe and where your frontal lobe is, for example, and so forth. But yes, they're mostly questions that are written in prose. Okay, what else can I tell you about the exam? If you haven't found out the details of the exam yet, be sure to go and have a look at your student portal, and your student portal will give you the details of the exam, and closer to the date will also give you the details of where you will be sitting in the exam hall. And it's a really big exam hall. So I suppose practically, you want to be comfortable for a start because, nobody's going to remember the frock that you wore to the Mind Brain Behavior 1 exam of 2018. But you'll remember how well you did on the exam. So you want to optimize those conditions. Be warm, be comfortable, because it's cold right now, isn't it? And there will be heaters in the building, but they're only so warm. And you may or may not be close to them. So be warm, be comfortable, bring some water, bring a spare pencil, bring a couple of pencils to fill in the answer sheet, bring an eraser, bring spares basically of everything. You never know if something's going to fail. It's always good to have a backup, right? There's no dress code for Melbourne University exams. Well, that's really interesting. I think just the dress code would be being dressed. I definitely turn up clothed. I think as long as you've got some form of clothes on, you will be fine. I have certainly numerous times seen people in their pajamas at the exam. Yeah. I'm doing so well today. I haven't spilt my coffee on myself, which is so much better than yesterday. We're getting the hang of this live streaming thing. Outside of the normal data analysis? No, not really. So, the SPSS questions aren't going to be along the lines of, what menu would you go to find such and such. It's not about that. It's more about interpreting output with SPSS. SPSS is really the tool, that you're going to be using. And my concern for you there is more about skill acquisition. And that's why I wanted to, for the first time ever, it's never been done before at the school, start you off with SPSS in the first semester of year one. It's such an important tool, and one that people use just so often. And so I really wanted to, with this research methods program, focus on conceptual understanding of the important things and skill acquisition. And so I suppose with SPSS, the really important thing is not necessarily clicking the buttons in the menu, right? The important thing is being able to understand what it's doing and what it's spitting out to you. When you see some output, what exactly is that output telling you? So you'll need to understand what output is. And I might ask you about that in a variety of ways. How are you all going with Simon's? questions and the experience of having been given the exam questions? Are you finding that is alleviating anxiety or adding to anxiety? How does that go for you? Both. Yeah, I can completely understand that. So with Simon's questions, oh, it's helping. Oh, good, good. Oh, good, good. Okay, yeah. I can get how it can be both anxiety relieving and alleviating. Okay, this is good. Okay, I can also understand how it could potentially create some anxiety when you try to anticipate what the answer might be. But it's great to orient you to, I suppose, what you need to learn. Mm. So, yeah, that's right. So that's a really good point, Philippa, about having difficulty in that section, working out what the content will be that's on the exam. So I suppose that's where maybe you could like systematically, you could even do this with a spreadsheet, systematically map the questions to the lectures and use the questions as your guide to studying for um, Simon's lectures. Um, oh, good. I'm glad to hear that is what some of you have been doing. Kick it up. Well done. So using those questions as a guide to study. Now, something you can all do collaboratively is talk about the questions on, with each other and on the discussion board. People have already started to do that a little. So if you want to talk about Simon's questions, you can absolutely do that on the discussion board on the LMS. You'll just find that I'm going to be necessarily vague and not tell you what the answer is. And Simon will do the same. So I'd suggest that have those discussions and sort of direct your questions to each other, maybe rather than necessarily to Simon and I, because we'll give you some smoke and mirrors and not tell you exactly what the answer is. But I'm perfectly happy for you guys to work out what the answers are together. And it really does work for his section of the subject, which, as a few of you have said, it can be a little bit more challenging to really tie down exactly what the core topics are that you need to learn about. But if you have a look at his commentaries, certainly, in addition to the lecture, and certainly then use those exam questions as your guide. And gosh, that one fish, two fish one, what's that all about? I wonder. The behavioral neuroscience component of the subject has probably got the most content, right? It's got tons of stuff you need to remember, from the level of the nervous system in down to its various subsystems, and all the way down to the level of the neuron, and even subcellular processes as well. So there is a lot to learn there. Again, I think economizing your time by starting and thinking about the 3 or 4 most important things from the lecture is a really good way to start. It is better to give a full exam practice paper instead of separating different topics. Well, yeah, that's an interesting challenge. So there could be, I suppose there's 2 ways to go about this. One would be to give a practice exam paper, but then the problem with that is that yeah, that's it's an interesting, just logistically, it's a little bit problematic, and that the way to do that would be to collate that practice exam before the semester starts. But so many of us, including myself, will be working on lecture content right up until maybe the day before the lecture content, and having a look at what's happened currently, what might be new and interesting to include in a lecture. So logistically, it's a little bit problematic. Hopefully, it still works okay for you in terms of having the individual practice questions from each lecturer for each section. The School of Psychology doesn't release previous exams. So some schools around the university will submit previous exams to the Value Library that you can access to prepare for the exam, which I am not a fan of as an academic, because it just makes it too easy to not learn anything, basically, and learn a little bit of the content that you know is going to likely be on the exam. I know certainly when I was in undergrad psychology, I took a sociology subject, and that had exams available through the library, and I got a few years worth of exams, and it was completely apparent that they rotated the exam every 2 years, and you knew exactly what the exam was going to be. So I don't think it's a great way to learn, because yes, I'm evil and I do have dual purposes here for you. On one hand, I need to assess you through the exam, but oh my God, I want you to learn something as well. So evil. I need my cat here so I can be stroking it. So I have a suggestion for you all who would like to have a mock exam. A really good way to do this is to get into a study group. So I was in a study group when I was in at your level of psychological study. And it was really beneficial. So my study group, we got together in the first semester and we stayed together throughout the entire degree. And when it came to this time of semester, we would break up the exam. And there were 4 of us. And so, for example, if it was this exam, we would have broken it up such that I would go away and prepare some mock multiple choice questions for the neuroscience bit. A friend of mine would go and do it for the sensation and perception and so on. And then we'd collate them, and then we'd get together, we'd have a lunch together, and we would do the practice exam together. And it's a great study technique. Absolutely, Acacia. It's a great way to learn, making your own questions. If you look at a lecture and think of yourself as a lecturer and think, okay, how will I examine this lecture content? You have a very good likelihood of ending up with the same types of questions that we would ask about the lecture content. So groups, you can use the discussion board to get your study groups going. And, study groups don't have to be face-to-face, but they can be. And it's great to work. I just think it's great to work in a group. There's lots of empirical literature that demonstrates that not only does that help in terms of reducing stress and improving well-being, but also improves performance on tasks like exams as well, regardless of how smart you are, believe it or not. That study group that I was telling you about there, most of us, 3 of the 4, went the whole way. 3 got PhDs, 2 in the area of clinical psychology and psychiatry, and one in the area of speech pathology. Let me just duck into the LMS quickly and see if anybody has made any questions in there. Since we've been going, no, nobody's put any questions in there. So if you've got any additional questions, now would probably be the time to ask. This doesn't have to be the last exam Q&A session that we have. Why don't we schedule one for next week? Let's do it now, actually. Okay, so the exam is a little way off yet, isn't it? So how about we schedule another exam AMA for next Thursday, the 31st. Okay, I'll put that in my diary right now. And by that time, you know, you'll be a week into study preparation, and I'll run it at 11 a.m. again. I can do that on that day. Okay, so here's what we'll do for that one. So for that particular live stream that I will do on Thursday, the 31st of May at 11 a.m., we can have another, general exam AMA, but we could also have a consultation session on research methods and the learning component of the course. So why don't we do that? If you've got any questions about research methods that you don't understand that you'd like me to explain, or about the learning component of the subject that you'd like me to explain, prepare them and get them ready to ask for Thursday, 11 a.m. next week. And how much detail do we need to know about achieving action potentials? Oh, that is a and one of those how long is a piece of string questions. I would suggest that there's probably going to be some questions about how an action potential happens on the exam. But here is the thing. You need to be clever about this and not sacrifice too much exam preparation time in learning just fundamental chemistry if chemistry is not your area, for the, and in the process neglect preparation for a lot of your other components of the exam. So there's 120 questions. There couldn't be all that many on action potential, surely, could there? So I suppose you need to think about striking that balance about the time that you have available and how much of that time you're willing to devote or should be devoting to learning in any particular thing. And there's two ways to go about it. You can just keep going and going and going at it until you've got it, or you can be strategic in another way and think, right, I'm going to cover the basics of this such that I've got a pretty good idea of what this concept is, such that in the context of 4 alternative answers attached to a question, I should be able to disambiguate what the right answer is, and then not spend a disproportionate amount of time focusing on one thing that you find difficult, to the detriment of your study for the other areas of the exam. And actually, That's a really important thing to remember for the exam. Don't spend too long on any one question. With 120 questions in 3 hours, that's 1.5 questions, 1.5 minutes, sorry, per question. So you don't want to spend, say, 10 minutes on any one question. That's spending way too much time on any one question. Don't get hung up on one. If you find that one's really difficult, leave it and come back to it. But what you need to do on the answer sheet is make sure that you're answering the right row for each question. So again, there's a row corresponding to each question. They're numbered. Say every 5 questions, just look at the answer sheet and make sure that you're coloring in the dot on the correct row. I guarantee that some of you won't be at some point in the exam. I've been there numerous times. So just always stop and check every 5 or 10 questions that you're answering in the right row. Yeah, certainly. So, or you can give your best guess and go back to it if you have time. Absolutely, that is one way to go about it. That's good, Acacia. Good suggestion. Oh, is there a bell curve to the WAM? Only 20. No. So with this exam, your score is going to be your score. So if everybody gets an H1 on the exam, then you'll all make me look very good. Thank you very much. But no. So the exam score will be the exam score that if you get 100% right, you're getting 100% right. If you get 50% right, your mark will be 50%, and so forth. If there are any adjustments in the final distribution of the entire subject, so at the end of semester, when I get together with the Board of Examiners and we collate the marks from the entire subject for every assessment and bring them all together, if there's any adjustment of marks, then I will let you know precisely what they are. They almost invariably are in the form of stretching upwards. But I will give you the details of that if that occurs, and most often it doesn't, in due course. So I think that's probably us done for today. So remember, Thursday next week, 11 a.m., I'll do another live stream, and you can ask me anything again about the exam, but also about the research methods or the learning component of the course. So maybe over the next week, you might want to have a look at that content and let me know, get your questions prepared so that we can discuss and I can answer them for you in effectively a consultation session like this. So as usual, of course, you can still go on and ask questions on the discussion board as well, and I'll get back to you. But I think that's probably it for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. It's always nice to see some people out there. I certainly haven't been, I didn't know how you'd respond to this idea of live streaming and if it was going to be helpful, but it sounds like the response is quite positive. So that's great, and I'll try to keep them coming for you. That's great. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. That's nice to hear. So you guys have a good day. Look after yourselves and have a nice weekend and get some downtime. And that's probably actually a really good thing to finish on, self-care during exam preparation. As you lead up to the exam, it's going to be a really stressful period. So while you're being very mindful to study for exams, also be mindful to look after yourself and take some time out and try to schedule into each day some time to do something that you like. And that might be going for a walk, it might be seeing a movie, catching up with friends, playing a video game. I'm not sure. But whatever it is, try to schedule yourself a little bit of time to relax and look after yourself too. And again, combining study with other people and working in a group can be a great way to enhance your well-being when you're again at 11 a.m. next Thursday. Bye.